Mick Jagger had been playing for 11 minutes when he stopped. Not at the end of a song, not at the natural pause between one verse and the next. He stopped in the middle of a chord, his fingers still on the strings. The last note hanging in the air of the studio and then thinning out and disappearing the way a note does when the hand that was holding it has gone somewhere else. His head had turned. Slowly, not toward Jimmy, not toward the audience, toward the monitor to the left of the stage, where a sound was now coming from that nobody had announced and nobody had introduced. A sound that had not been there a moment before and was now filling the studio with the particular quality of something recorded long ago, on equipment that was not designed for perfection. The slight warmth and compression of an old tape, a voice caught in a room that was not a studio, a voice singing something that Mick Jagger had not heard in 53 years. His hand came off the strings. Jimmy Fallon watched it happen from behind his desk. He watched Mick Jagger's hand leave the guitar with the slowness of a person who is not deciding to stop, but who has simply stopped, the way a clock stops, completely, without negotiation, without wind down. He watched Jagger's shoulders, which had been moving with the easy physical confidence of a man who has been on stages since 1962, go still. He watched his head tilt, just slightly, the way a person's head tilts when they are trying to locate a sound they are not certain they are hearing correctly. And then he watched Mick Jagger's face do something that Jimmy Fallon had never seen it do in 30 years of watching Mick Jagger perform. It went quiet. Not blank. Not empty. Quiet, the way a room goes quiet when the thing that was filling it has been replaced by something older and more essential. His jaw was set. His eyes were moving across the monitor without blinking. His right hand, the one that had been on the strings, was hanging in the air beside the guitar, suspended, neither reaching for the instrument nor pulling away from it, simply there, motionless, as if the decision about what to do with it next required something that was not yet available to him. Jimmy did not speak. He had been told what was on the recording. He had been told what it would do. He had not been told whether he was ready to watch it happen. And he understood now, watching it, that ready was not the relevant category. Some things you are not ready for. You are simply present for them. 300 people in that studio held their breath. The entire studio froze. The camera operators held their positions with the particular stillness of professionals who have spent careers learning when to move and when to be still, and who understand, when stillness is required, how to hold it completely. The floor director had both hands at her sides. The band, the Tonight Show band, which had been backing Jagger for the last 11 minutes with the focused, electric attention that musicians bring to playing beside a legend, had stopped one by one as Jagger stopped, instruments going quiet in sequence, until the only sound in the room was the recording coming from the monitor and the faint ambient breath of 300 people doing their best not to disturb it. In the fifth row, a woman in her 70s had turned to the man beside her, and he was already looking at her, and neither of them said anything. Was something wrong? The audience leaned forward, uncertain. Mick Jagger was 80 years old. He had performed in some form on every continent, before audiences of hundreds of thousands, through everything that a life and a career and the specific turbulence of being the Rolling Stones could produce. He did not stop. He was one of the people in the world about whom it was most completely true that they did not stop. And yet, here he was, stopped, standing at the front of a Tonight Show stage in October 2023, with his hand hanging in the air beside a guitar, and his face doing something that had no name in the vocabulary of live television. Listening to a recording coming from a monitor with the total, undivided, undefended attention of a man who has just heard something he gave up, expecting to hear again. His lips moved once, without sound. Then he said one word, barely above a whisper, barely a word at all, more breath than sound, more recognition than language, caught only because the studio was by then so completely still that even the quietest thing could find its way to the microphone. He said, "Eddie." To understand what happened on that stage in October 2023, you need to understand what happened in the spring of 1962. Mick Jagger wasn't always Mick Jagger, icon and legend. In 1962, he was 18 years old, studying at the London School of Economics on a grant he was not certain he would keep, spending every available hour on the music that he was even less certain about. Not whether he wanted it, he had never been uncertain about that, but whether it wanted him back in any form that the world would recognize. He had been playing since he was a teenager, had been in and out of pickup bands, had met Keith Richards on a platform at Dartford Station the previous year through the specific accident of Keith noticing the records under his arm. And the two of them had been moving toward something together ever since, though what that something was had not yet fully declared itself. That spring, the band that would become the Rolling Stones was not yet fully formed. There was no name. There were rehearsals in flats, performances in pubs and small clubs, the accumulated energy of a group of young men who were entirely serious about something the world had not yet agreed to take seriously. One of those small clubs was a place called the Ealing Club in West London, a jazz and blues venue in a basement on the Uxbridge Road, one of the early homes of the British rhythm and blues scene, the kind of place where the audience was small and knowledgeable, and the musicians were permitted to be genuinely themselves because the stakes were low enough to allow it. Jagger had performed there several times in the spring of 1962, with various configurations of what would eventually become the Stones. It was at the Ealing Club on a Saturday evening in April that he met a man named Edward Hollis. Everyone called him Eddie. Eddie was 58 years old. He was a postman from Shepherd's Bush who had been coming to the Ealing Club every Saturday evening since it opened, because the Ealing Club played American blues, real blues, the kind that had come over on records from Chicago and Mississippi and had been copied and studied by the young British musicians who were the core of the scene, and Eddie had been in love with American blues music for 30 years. He had discovered it in 1932, when he was 18 years old, through a record a friend had brought back from the United States, a 78 of Robert Johnson, scratched and slightly warped, played on a gramophone in a front room in Shepherd's Bush, and the music had entered him the way certain music enters certain people, not as entertainment, but as weather, something that changes the climate of a life. He was not a musician. He had never learned to play. He had spent 30 years being in the presence of this music without being able to make it, which was a specific and uncomplaining form of devotion that Jagger, who was just learning what devotion to music actually required of a person, found quietly staggering. Eddie came to the Ealing Club not to be seen and not to be part of anything social. He came to listen. He always sat in the same seat, a stool at the far left of the bar, where he could hear everything without being directly in the path of anything. He listened with his arms folded and his eyes forward in an expression of complete, composed absorption that made him look from the stage less like an audience member and more like a judge, not a harsh one, not a critical one, but the kind that is paying attention fully enough to actually know what they are hearing. Jagger noticed him first because of the attention. You learn, when you begin performing, to read audiences. You learn which faces are with you and which are elsewhere. Eddie Hollis was never elsewhere. He was always completely there. After a performance in April, Jagger went to the bar for a drink and found himself standing beside the man from the stool, at the far left. He introduced himself. Eddie looked at him with the level attention he brought to everything and said, "You've got the blues in you. Most of these boys are doing the blues." You've got it in you. There's a difference. Jagger had been told he was good before. He had been told this by people whose opinion he respected and whose judgment he trusted. He had not been told this by a 58-year-old postman from Shepherd's Bush who had spent 30 years listening to the real thing and had arrived at an opinion through nothing but that exposure. He stood at the bar and received it as what it was, which was the most purely credentialed assessment of his singing he had ever received. They talked for 2 hours. About the records Eddie had collected, 40 years of American blues on shellac and vinyl, stored in a flat in Shepherd's Bush, with a care that bordered on archival devotion. About what the blues actually was, underneath the music. What it was for. What it had come from. What it required of the people who carried it. About the difference between performing feeling and having it. Eddie did not speak about technique. He spoke about authenticity, the way someone speaks about it, when they have spent 30 years studying what it sounds like when it is present and what it sounds like when it is absent, and have developed, through that study, an ability to distinguish between them that has nothing to do with music theory and everything to do with accumulated honest listening. He told Jagger, "The blues is not sad." That's the misunderstanding. The blues is truthful. There's a difference. Sad is an emotion. Truthful is a relationship with reality. What you're doing when you do it right is telling the truth about what it feels like to be alive. Not performing the feeling. Telling the truth about it. Jagger was 18 years old, and he was listening with everything he had. They met at the Ealing Club most Saturday evenings through the rest of the spring and into the summer. Eddie would bring records sometimes, not to give, just to describe, to play in the air with his hands while he talked, to offer as evidence. He brought Robert Johnson into conversations the way a scholar brings primary sources. He talked about Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Sonny Boy Williamson with the precision of someone who had listened to each record enough times to hear past the music into the intention underneath it. And Jagger listened, because Eddie was describing something he had been reaching for without knowing what it was called. In the summer of 1962, Eddie did something that he described, when he did it, as completely ordinary, and that Jagger understood immediately was not ordinary at all. He went home after a Saturday evening at the Ealing Club, one of the last evenings before the summer ended and the calendar became more complicated, and he recorded himself. Not performing. He had a reel-to-reel machine he used to copy records, and he sat alone in his front room in Shepherd's Bush and spoke into the microphone for 20 minutes, describing what he had heard in his 30 years of listening, what he believed the blues was trying to do, what he believed Jagger was beginning to do. He used no notes. He spoke the way he always spoke, plainly, directly, without flourish, with the unhurried specificity of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has arrived at language that fits. He gave the tape to Jagger the following Saturday. He said, something to listen to on the road. The road, by that point, was beginning. The Stones were forming into the thing they were going to be. The venues were getting larger. The calendar was filling. Jagger had taken the tape and listened to it on a small reel-to-reel in a borrowed flat in Soho on a Tuesday afternoon, alone, and had sat with it for a long time after it ended, not moving, just sitting with what it had said. He had kept the tape. He had kept it through everything, through the first recordings, through the first tours, through the years of becoming the thing that the whole world eventually understood the Rolling Stones to be. He had kept it because the tape was the closest thing he had to a document of what he had been reaching for, before the reaching became famous. He had lost it in 1972 during a move between properties, in the way that objects are lost during the acceleration of a life that has outgrown the capacity to keep track of everything. He had not known it was gone until he went looking for it, and it was not there. He had looked for it twice after that, methodically, without result. He had accepted its absence the way you accept the absence of something irreplaceable, not entirely, never entirely, but with the functional resignation of a person who understands that some losses are permanent and that continued looking is a form of not accepting what cannot be changed. He had thought about Eddie Hollis many times. He had thought about him when critics wrote about what the Rolling Stones had done for the blues, about authenticity, about the difference between performance and truth, the precise distinction Eddie had made at a bar in the Ealing Club in 1962. Sitting on the far left stool with his arms folded, describing what 30 years of listening had taught him. He had tried in the mid-1970s to find Eddie through contacts in West London. Nobody he reached knew of an Edward Hollis from Shepherd's Bush. The postman's route changed over time. The neighborhood changed. The Ealing Club itself had closed. The world in which Eddie Hollis had been a weekly fixture at a stool at the far left of the bar had folded up behind him. He had been carrying Eddie Hollis for 61 years. The gratitude without a destination. The debt with no address. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, what had been found was not Eddie. Eddie Hollis had died in 1989, at 85 years old, still in Shepherd's Bush, still with his collection of records, still going wherever he could find blues music being played with honesty. What had been found was the tape. It had surfaced through a woman named Vivienne Okafor, 64 years old, an archivist at a music preservation charity in London, who had spent 20 years collecting and cataloging audio material from the early British rhythm and blues era, recordings made in flats and rehearsal rooms and small clubs in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the material that documented the world out of which British rock and roll had grown. She had acquired a collection of reel-to-reel tapes from the estate of a woman in Shepherd's Bush, whose father had been, according to the estate, a great lover of American blues music. Among the tapes in that collection, most of which were recordings of records, copies made on a home machine with patient and careful devotion, was one that was different. Not a record. A voice, a man speaking alone into a microphone, in a front room, describing something at length, plainly and directly, without notes. Vivienne had listened to the tape. She had recognized what it was describing. She had recognized the name it used, a name that appeared twice in the 20 minutes of recording, spoken with the matter-of-fact familiarity of a man discussing a young musician he had encountered and believed in. She had written to the Rolling Stones management company in January 2023. The tape had reached Mick Jagger by February. He had listened to it alone, in his home, on a Tuesday morning, on equipment Vivienne's charity had used to digitize it before sending. He had listened to it once. Then he had sat very still for a long time. Then he had called his manager and said 3 words, "I want to perform." The arrangement with The Tonight Show had been made 6 weeks before the October taping. Jagger would perform. He would be playing, guitar, alone, a blues standard, something from the tradition Eddie had described when the tape began playing from the monitor. He had chosen the moment himself. He had asked that it begin at the 11-minute mark of the performance. He had not explained why. The production team had not asked. The 11-minute mark was where, in every live performance he had ever given, the music had stopped being performed and had become something else. The mark he had located in 1962 in a flat in Soho on a Tuesday afternoon, listening to a reel-to-reel tape from a postman in Shepherd's Bush, and had been finding ever since. Now, Eddie Hollis's voice was filling the studio from the monitor. The compression of the tape gave it a particular warmth. Not degraded, not difficult to hear, but old, present, unmistakably itself. His voice was plain and deliberate and completely certain. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years arriving at language that fit. And it was saying something about authenticity and truth, and the difference between performing a feeling and telling the truth about what it felt like to be alive. And Mick Jagger was standing at the front of the Tonight Show stage, with his hand hanging in the air beside a guitar, not moving, listening with everything he had, the way he had listened in 1962. Jimmy Fallon had not moved either. His hands were flat on the desk. His face had not changed expression in 4 minutes, which was not a thing that happened to Jimmy Fallon. He was not a person whose face remained unchanged. He was watching Mick Jagger be 18 years old in a room full of people. And he understood that what he was witnessing was not a television moment, and was not a performance, and was not something that required anything from him except the willingness to be entirely still and let it be what it was. The tape ran for 3 minutes and 40 seconds from the point it had been started. When it ended, the monitor went silent. The studio was completely quiet. Not the quiet of anticipation, the quiet of aftermath, the kind that settles after something has passed through a room and rearranged everything inside it. Mick Jagger had not moved. Then, slowly, the framework's word, the right word, the only word. His hand came back to the guitar strings. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers found a chord. He did not play it immediately. He held it there, the chord, his fingers pressing the strings without sounding them, as if deciding something. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. He began to play. Not the blues standard he had been playing before. Something else. Something that nobody in the room recognized. Something that had not been played before in any studio or on any stage. A melody that moved with the plainness and directness of Eddie Hollis's voice, that carried the unhurried specificity of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has arrived at sound that fits. He played it all the way through. He did not sing. He let the guitar say what it was saying without adding words, because some things are better said without them. When he finished, he looked up at Jimmy. Jimmy's eyes were wet. He had stopped trying to do anything about it. Jagger said, "I wrote that in 1964. I never recorded it. I never played it for anyone." He paused. His voice was level, the voice of a man choosing every word with the care of someone who knows how to do that. I called it Eddie's thing, just to myself. I never named it properly. I played it sometimes, alone, when I needed to remember what I was supposed to be doing. He looked back at the guitar. I hadn't played it since 1972. He looked at Jimmy. Since the tape went missing, Jimmy said, very quietly, and now the tape came back. Jagger said, and now the tape came back. The silence that followed was the kind that a room creates when it has been given something true and needs a moment to confirm that it is real. Then the audience rose, all 300 of them, not from the back, not slowly, but all at once, from every part of the room simultaneously, which is the rarest kind of standing ovation, the kind that does not begin anywhere because it begins everywhere. The kind that happens when a room has been inside something together and comes up for air together and is grateful together. Jimmy Fallon pressed both hands flat on his desk and did not stand up. He sat there with his hands on the desk and let the room do what it was doing, because there was nothing he could add to it, and he was wise enough to know it. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Vivienne Okafor flew from London to New York for the taping, at Jagger's invitation. She sat in the front row. After the show, in a room backstage, Jagger spent 40 minutes with her, asking about the tape, how it had been found, what condition it was in, what else was in the collection from Shepherd's Bush. She described each tape in the collection from memory. He listened with the same focused, undefended attention he had brought to a stool at the far left of a bar in 1962. He asked if he could have the original tape. She said she would need to consult the charity's acquisition policy. He said he understood. 3 weeks later, the charity's board voted unanimously to transfer custody to him, with the condition that a digitized archive copy be maintained and made available to music historians. He agreed without hesitation. The original reel sits in his home in London now. Not stored, not archived, on a shelf in the room where he works, at eye level, beside a reel-to-reel machine he had restored specifically for this purpose. He plays it occasionally, not often. The way you visit something important, not constantly, not casually, but with intention, on the days when you need to remember what you are supposed to be doing. He recorded Eddie's Thing in the spring of 2024. Studio, proper recording, full version, 6 minutes and 12 seconds, guitar only, no voice, no lyrics. He released it on a Tuesday in May with a note that read in its entirety for Eddie Hollis of Shepherd's Bush, who told me in 1962 what the blues actually was. I have been trying to play it ever since. It charted in 14 countries. He did not do press for it. He did not explain it further than the note. He did not need to. Some teachers spend 30 years listening before they teach one lesson. The lesson takes 20 minutes and is delivered plainly, into a microphone, in a front room, without notes. And somewhere in the world a person receives it and builds a life around it and is grateful for 61 years. And the gratitude finds its way home eventually, the way all honest things find their way home, which is slowly and completely and exactly on time.